Have you ever wondered why silence becomes a weapon when it should be a refuge? The quiet spaces between words can transform from peaceful pauses into deafening punishments, especially when avoidant silence becomes their chosen form of control. This phenomenon reveals one of the most complex patterns in human relationships, where the absence of communication speaks louder than any argument ever could. When someone uses silence as their primary response to conflict or emotional intimacy, they are not simply being quiet. They are engaging in a sophisticated defense mechanism that protects their inner world while simultaneously creating distance from those who matter most. This avoidant silence becomes their punishment, not just for others, but ultimately for themselves. The very tool they use to feel safe becomes the prison that keeps them isolated from genuine connection. Understanding this pattern requires looking beyond the surface behavior to the underlying fears that drive it. People who retreat into silence during emotional moments are often operating from a place of deep vulnerability, even though their behavior appears cold or dismissive. They have learned, usually early in life, that emotional expression leads to pain, rejection, or overwhelming feelings they cannot manage. Silence becomes their sanctuary, but it gradually transforms into something far more destructive. The psychology behind avoidant silence reveals fascinating insights about human attachment patterns and the ways people protect themselves from perceived threats to their emotional well-being. Those who use silence as a primary coping mechanism often display characteristics of avoidant attachment, a style that develops when someone learns to rely primarily on themselves for emotional regulation and safety. This pattern affects millions of relationships, creating cycles of misunderstanding and emotional distance that can persist for years. The silent partner feels protected but increasingly isolated, while their loved ones feel shut out and often blame themselves for the growing emotional gulf. Neither side understands the true dynamics at play, leading to frustration, resentment, and often the end of relationships that could have thrived with better understanding. But here's what makes this topic so crucial to understand. Avoidant silence is not a character flaw or a deliberate attempt to cause pain. It is a learned survival strategy that once served an important purpose but has outlived its usefulness. Recognizing this distinction opens the door to compassion, both for those who use silence as protection and for those who love them despite the walls they build. Throughout this exploration, we'll uncover the hidden costs of using silence as a shield, examine real stories that illustrate these patterns in action, and discover practical approaches for breaking free from cycles that hurt everyone involved. The goal is not to judge or blame, but to understand the complex emotional landscape that creates these patterns and find pathways toward healthier connection. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Consider the story of a woman who found herself married to a man whose silence felt like punishment, though neither of them understood why their conversations always seemed to end in emotional distance. Sarah had grown up in a household where feelings were discussed openly, sometimes loudly, but always with the understanding that working through emotions together strengthened relationships. Her husband Michael came from a very different world, where emotional displays were seen as weaknesses and problems were expected to be solved privately without burdening others. Their first major conflict arose 6 months after their wedding, over something seemingly trivial: how to spend their first Christmas together. Sarah wanted to visit both sets of parents, believing that compromise and discussion would help them find a solution that worked for everyone. She approached the conversation with enthusiasm, ready to brainstorm creative options and share her feelings about the importance of family traditions. Michael's response was immediate withdrawal. As Sarah's voice grew more animated and her ideas more elaborate, he felt increasingly overwhelmed by what seemed like an avalanche of expectations and emotions. Instead of expressing his discomfort or sharing his own preferences, he simply stopped responding. not with anger or obvious rejection, but with a kind of blank stillness that made Sarah feel like she was talking to a wall. What Sarah interpreted as rejection or dismissal was actually Michael's attempt to regulate his own emotional state. He had learned early in life that intense emotional conversations often led to unpredictable outcomes, and his nervous system had been trained to shut down rather than engage when feelings ran high. This response had served him well in his family of origin, where emotional restraint was valued and rewarded. But the silence that protected Michael felt like punishment to Sarah. She found herself talking more, trying harder to get a response, which only increased Michael's sense of being overwhelmed and his need to retreat further. This created what psychologists call a pursuit-withdraw cycle, where one partner's attempts to connect trigger the other partner's need to create distance, which then intensifies the first partner's efforts to reconnect. The cognitive bias at play here is called the fundamental attribution error, where people tend to attribute others' behavior to their character rather than their circumstances. Sarah began to believe that Michael's silence meant he didn't care about her feelings or their relationship, while Michael assumed that Sarah's persistent communication attempts meant she was trying to control or overwhelm him. Neither understood the underlying attachment dynamics driving their responses. Over months, this pattern became entrenched. Sarah learned to expect silence when she raised important topics, so she began approaching conversations with anxiety and frustration already present. Michael learned that conversations with Sarah often felt overwhelming, so he began preparing to withdraw even before she started speaking. Their nervous systems were essentially training each other to expect conflict and distance. The turning point came during what should have been a celebration. Michael received a promotion at work, something he had worked toward for 2 years. When he came home with the news, Sarah was genuinely excited and wanted to celebrate together, to talk about what this meant for their future and how proud she was of his achievement. But Michael's response to her enthusiasm was his familiar silence, and Sarah felt shut out of what should have been their shared joy. That night, Sarah realized that Michael's silence had become a barrier not just to resolving conflict, but to sharing happiness, dreams, and the intimate moments that make relationships meaningful. She understood that something fundamental needed to change, but she didn't yet know how to bridge the gap between their different emotional languages. The resolution of their story would come later, through understanding and deliberate changes to their patterns, but first, they had to recognize how avoidant silence had indeed become a punishment for both of them. Michael was punishing himself by remaining isolated from the person he loved most, while Sarah was being punished for wanting connection and emotional intimacy. Now, let's explore practical ways to recognize and address these patterns when they appear in relationships. The first step is understanding that avoidant silence is not a conscious choice to cause harm, but rather an automatic response designed to protect someone from perceived emotional threats. This recognition allows for compassion rather than blame, which is essential for creating change. When dealing with someone who uses silence as their primary coping mechanism, the natural impulse is often to push harder for communication. This approach usually backfires because it confirms the silent person's unconscious belief that emotional conversations are overwhelming and potentially dangerous. Instead, the most effective approach is to create safety and reduce the emotional intensity of interactions. Creating safety means approaching conversations with curiosity rather than demands. Instead of saying something like, "Why won't you talk to me?" try, "I notice you seem to need some space when we discuss certain topics, and I want to understand how to make these conversations feel more comfortable for both of us." This approach removes the implicit criticism and shows genuine interest in understanding rather than changing the other person. Timing becomes crucial when addressing avoidant silence patterns. Attempting to process emotional topics when tensions are already high is rarely successful. The person's nervous system is already activated and primed for withdrawal, making genuine communication nearly impossible. Instead, Choose calm moments when both people feel relaxed and connected to introduce conversations about communication patterns themselves. The concept of emotional regulation plays a central role in breaking cycles of avoidant silence. People who retreat into silence often do so because they feel flooded by emotions and don't have effective strategies for managing intense feelings while staying engaged in conversation. Teaching and modeling emotional regulation techniques can gradually help them feel safer during emotional interactions. One effective technique is called the 20-minute rule. When conversations become heated or one person begins to withdraw, both parties agree to take a 20-minute break to calm their nervous systems before returning to the discussion. This prevents the silent person from feeling trapped or overwhelmed, while also preventing the pursuing partner from escalating their efforts to get a response. During these breaks, each person focuses on self-soothing activities that help them return to a calmer state. This might include deep breathing, going for a walk, listening to music, or any activity that helps regulate their emotional state without numbing or avoiding the underlying issues that need to be addressed. Another powerful approach involves validating the protective function of silence before asking for change. Acknowledge that silence has served an important purpose and that moving toward more open communication represents a risk for the person who has relied on withdrawal for safety. This validation reduces defensiveness and creates space for gradual change, rather than demanding immediate transformation. The person who pursues connection also has important work to do in changing these patterns. Learning to tolerate periods of silence without interpreting them as rejection requires developing emotional regulation skills and examining their own attachment fears. Often, the pursuing partner has their own deep fears of abandonment that get triggered by their loved one's withdrawal, creating a cycle where both people's attachment systems are activated simultaneously. Building new communication patterns requires patience and consistency. Change happens gradually as both partners learn to trust that emotional conversations can be safe and manageable. The silent partner needs repeated experiences of staying engaged during emotional discussions without feeling overwhelmed or criticized, while the pursuing partner needs evidence that their loved one can stay present and connected even when feelings are involved. Setting clear boundaries around communication can actually help both partners feel safer. This might include agreements about how to signal when someone needs a break, how long breaks will last, and how to reconnect after difficult conversations. Having a structured approach reduces the unpredictability that often makes emotional conversations feel dangerous to avoidant partners. The role of individual therapy cannot be understated when addressing deeply ingrained patterns of avoidant silence. These patterns often have roots in early childhood experiences and may require professional support to fully understand and change. A skilled therapist can help individuals explore the origins of their communication patterns and develop new strategies for emotional regulation and connection. For the partner of someone who uses avoidant silence, developing their own support system becomes crucial. Friends, family members, or support groups can provide the emotional connection and validation that may be missing in their primary relationship, while their partner works on becoming more emotionally available. This external support prevents the pursuing partner from becoming overly focused on getting all their emotional needs met by someone who is currently unable to provide that level of connection. Understanding the difference between healthy space and avoidant silence helps both partners recognize what they're working toward. Healthy space involves communicating about the need for time alone and maintaining connection even during periods of individual processing. Avoidant silence, by contrast, involves cutting off communication without explanation and using withdrawal as a way to avoid, rather than process, difficult emotions. The journey from avoidant silence to healthy communication is not linear. There will be setbacks, moments of falling back into old patterns, and times when progress feels impossibly slow. Expecting this reality helps both partners maintain patience and compassion during the change process, rather than giving up when challenges arise. Celebrating small victories becomes essential for maintaining motivation during this transformation. Noticing when the typically silent partner shares a feeling, stays present during a difficult conversation, or communicates about needing space rather than simply withdrawing, represents significant progress that should be acknowledged and appreciated. The transformation from avoidant silence to genuine communication represents one of the most profound journeys two people can take together. Like characters Joe Goldberg from Netflix's You, or Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl, people often use protective strategies that ultimately isolate them from the very connections they crave most deeply. The difference lies in choosing growth over self-protection, vulnerability over control, and connection over the familiar comfort of emotional distance. Breaking free from patterns of avoidant silence requires courage from both partners, but the rewards extend far beyond improved communication. When someone who has relied on silence learns to stay present during emotional moments, they discover parts of themselves that have been hidden for years. They experience the profound relief of being known and accepted, even in their vulnerability. This transformation touches every aspect of their relationships, from how they handle conflict to how they share joy and celebrate successes together. The person who has been pursuing connection also experiences profound changes during this process. Learning to create safety rather than demand communication teaches important lessons about influence versus control. They discover that their own emotional regulation and responses have tremendous power to shape the dynamics in their relationships. This knowledge extends beyond romantic partnerships to friendships, family relationships, and professional interactions. Understanding avoidant silence as a form of self-punishment reframes the entire dynamic from one of blame to one of compassion. The person using silence is not trying to hurt their loved ones, even though that may be the result. They are trying to protect themselves using strategies that once worked but have now become barriers to the very connections that could heal their deepest wounds. The cognitive biases that maintain these patterns, particularly the fundamental attribution error, lose their power when people understand the true motivations behind seemingly hurtful behavior. Instead of assuming that silence means lack of caring, partners can recognize it as a sign of overwhelm or fear. This shift in understanding opens possibilities for connection that seemed impossible when the behavior was interpreted as rejection or punishment. The ripple effects of healing avoidant silence patterns extend beyond the immediate relationship to future generations. Children who grow up witnessing healthy emotional communication learn that feelings are manageable and that relationships can handle difficult conversations. They develop secure attachment patterns that serve them throughout their lives, breaking cycles that may have persisted for generations. This work requires ongoing commitment and awareness. Even after establishing healthier communication patterns, stress, major life changes, or other challenges can trigger temporary returns to old coping mechanisms. The difference lies in recognizing these patterns quickly and having tools to address them before they become entrenched again. The ultimate goal is not perfect communication, but rather the development of repair skills that allow relationships to recover from misunderstandings and disconnections. Every relationship experiences moments of distance or conflict, but couples who have learned to recognize and address avoidant silence patterns have powerful tools for returning to connection and intimacy. Take the first step today by examining your own communication patterns with honest curiosity rather than judgment. Notice whether you tend to pursue or withdraw during emotional conversations, and consider how your responses might be influenced by your own attachment history and fears. Share this exploration with trusted friends or partners, creating opportunities for deeper understanding and connection. Remember that changing these patterns is not about fixing something broken, but about expanding your capacity for the intimacy and connection that make relationships truly fulfilling. The silence that once felt like punishment can transform into the peaceful space between two people who know they are truly seen and accepted by each other.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.